So welcome again to our session. We will have a time for questions at the end, but if you do have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to raise your hand in the chat or type them into the chat. And you can do that by going to, you can find the chat hopefully by going to your toolbar and your menu and finding the chat there. You should be able to find reactions or participants and be able to find those hands up or to let us know that you do have a question. And we can either then unmute you, or once again, if you put them in the chat, I will be moderating the chat as well. All right, so at this point, I am going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to pass the mic over to Laura.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. As Kate said, my name is Laura Saunders. I'm a professor of Library and Information Science at Simmons University, and I'm really excited to be here to talk with you today. I have some slides to share, but as Kate said, please feel free to interrupt me if you have questions or comments as we go. You can put them in the chat or raise your hand and take the mic. And then my discussion is going to be followed by my colleague Lisa Hussey, and then we definitely will have time for more questions and discussion at the end. So our topic today is universal design for learning. And sorry, I'm just arranging my screen so I can see everything. So universal design for learning. And what I'd like to do today is just kind of introduce you to this topic and give a little bit of background about what it is, and also how it relates to careers in library and information science. And then Lisa's going to talk about some more specific applications. So first of all, universal design is a concept that was developed quite some time ago, and it can be helpful to understand universal design before we talk about universal design for learning, because universal design for learning, which is also sometimes called UDL, grew out of the principles of universal design. So universal design is defined as design and composition of an environment so that it can be accessed, understood, and used to the greatest extent possible by all people, regardless of their age, size, ability, or disability. So the point with universal design is that it acknowledges that not everybody accesses information or space, physical space or virtual space in the same way, and that we can make for better use of our space and better access of our space if we design it properly from the beginning. So the idea there is that we're not retroactively trying to fit things to different circumstances, but we're actually planning for those different circumstances from the outset. So it goes on, the definition goes on to say, an environment or any building, product, or service in that environment should be designed to meet the needs of all people who wish to use it. And while universal design was initially developed with more of the focus on physical space, I think this part of the definition shows how it can be applied to things like classrooms and classroom instruction, because you're starting to talk about not just the space, although classroom space could certainly fall into that, but also the services that are provided within a space. And then the last part of the definition is that this is not a special requirement for the benefit of only a minority of the population. It is a fundamental condition of good design. So again, the idea here is that we're not trying to retrofit things because of a special need, but we're actually acknowledging that there are all different kinds of needs that exist across various individuals and communities. Those needs can shift over time. I might have a different need if I am, a pregnant woman, if I am a person who has broken an arm or a leg, if I am experiencing some sort of temporary situation. And so just recognizing those different states. So then taking universal design and building on it, the definition for universal design for learning is a framework to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all people based on scientific insights into how humans learn. So what I'm going to do now is just kind of walk us through some of the basic principles for universal design for learning. But first, let's just talk about why this is important. And so just as with universal design, this is really about accessibility. It comes from understanding that not all of our learners are going to approach either the classroom or the content in the same way. And so if we want all of our learners to have an equitable experience, and if we want them to feel included in the learning, and not just included, but feel like they belong there, then we have to consider those different approaches that they might be taking, the different needs that they might have, the different preferences they might have from the beginning. So if we design our learning and our learning objects with that approach in mind from the beginning, the idea is that all of our learners, or at least a very large majority of our learners, should be able to access our content and should feel like they are included in the learning experience. So one of the ways that universal design for learning encourages us to think about learning is through multiple means of engagement. So with engagement, what we're talking about is the why of learning. So in other words, people come to learning for different reasons. Now, in some cases, they may not have a real choice, right? They might be students in school who have to be there. But even in that case, there can be different reasons that will motivate them to engage with the learning, even if they have to be there. And then for those of us who might be working in, for instance, public libraries, or even academic libraries where our patrons actually choose to use us on their own, and certainly in other kinds of information settings like special libraries and archives and things like that, where our patrons choose to use us, then we need to think about why. What is the motivation behind that? So the idea is that learners differ in terms of what motivates them and engages them. And so in order to reach the widest variety of learners, we have to provide them with different means for engaging with the content in the materials. So in other words, not just here's a one-size-fits-all lesson plan, but let's think about what are the different ways that students could interact with this content that might make it more engaging for them, that might give people different avenues into the same content. So there's lots of different ways you can do this, and I linked to the cast.edu, which is the organization that has really developed these principles, and you can go to their website to see a lot more examples. But some of the ways in which we can provide those different means of engagement is by giving our students some choice and some autonomy. So again, it's not one size fits all. It's not that you have to read this text or you have to watch this video and then you have to do this assignment, but giving them some ways of individualizing and personalizing it in a way that will help them to approach it in a way that is going to be of interest to them. It's also about making the content relevant. And as the people who design the instruction, we often know why it's relevant or important, but if we aren't transparent about that, if we don't explain it, it may not be obvious to the learners. It may not be obvious why we're asking them to work in groups, for instance, or it might not be obvious why we're asking them to read this text instead of that text. And so we can make things relevant by explaining things and by making the connections between what's happening in the classroom or the workshop and what's going to happen in the students' lives, whether it's connecting it to their background and their experience, to their the work that they're going to be doing in a course or a classroom, or the work that they're doing in their jobs and professional lives. Offering them collaborative opportunities, because again, some students will prefer to work collaboratively. Giving them meaningful feedback, so as they are going through the instruction, and especially as they're going through assignments, giving them feedback that they can use, and giving them opportunities for self-assessment so that they can see that they're making progress, and that can often help for motivation. So one quick example of this is, imagine a classroom, maybe 5th, 6th grade classroom where we're teaching math skills. If we gave students the choice to study statistics or to study math by using sports statistics and calculating what's happening with their favorite teams and their favorite players, or allow them to create a budget for a dream trip, or use measurements to build and decorate a house, right? So we could get to a lot of the same math concepts, but we could use lots of different ways of getting there. And some of these might appeal to some of our students more than others. The second principle of UDL is multiple means of representation. So this gets to how people learn, and it recognizes that learners are going to differ in how they perceive and understand information. And so in order to reach the widest variety of learners, we have to give them options in how their materials are accessed. So again, this comes back to not just focusing on one way of delivering content. Read this text or listen to this video or maybe even listen to this lecture, right? But it's thinking about what are some of the different ways that students could interact with the content and still arrive at the same information. And so there, again, are lots of different ways that we could do this. One would be to provide alternatives for text and audio. You might see this, for instance, I am someone who does not necessarily always have the patience to sit down and watch a 30-minute video or listen to a 30-minute podcast. That might tell you more about me than you need to know. But if there's a transcript, I'm happy to look at it because I know how to skim a transcript and pick out the important parts. And it also gives me the opportunity to look at it as a whole and decide, do I want to invest those 30 minutes? So alternatives for text and audio, because on the other hand, some people don't want to have to engage with the text and they're happy to sit back and listen to the audio. Maybe they're commuting and they're in their car and they can't be looking at the text. So alternatives like that. Clarifying vocabulary, symbols, and things like that. Again, not making an assumption that people know the jargon of a discipline or even like the specialized symbols that might go into things like math problems, and providing explanations that can help to scaffold the learning. Giving students the opportunity to customize what they're working with, and this is especially easy when we're using online tools where they maybe can increase the font, change the brightness, even little things like that can make it easier for them to access the material in a way that's comfortable for them. Activating background knowledge, so this means recognizing that our students aren't blank slates, that they come to us with experiences, they come to us with knowledge that's already relevant. And so this gets back to the motivation because we're connecting what we're doing to what they already know, but it also means that it helps them to connect what they're learning. When they can connect what they're learning to what they already know, it helps them to kind of create that mental model and to remember what they're learning. And then also just giving them guides through information processing. What this means is even doing little things like creating reading guides for a text or reflection and discussion questions that help the students to key in on the important parts, giving them graphic organizers to help them organize the information that they're learning and things like that. So again, one quick example of this is providing transcripts for audio materials so that the learners can choose which way they would prefer to engage with the content. And then finally, the third and last principle of universal design for learning is multiple means of action and expression. So this gets to the what of learning, or how people demonstrate what they've learned. And it recognizes that learners differ in how they navigate material and how they express what they know. And so in order to reach all learners, we have to provide them options both for navigating the materials, but also for demonstrating learning and achievement. So again, there's lots of different ways that we can do this. A few examples include varying methods of navigation and use. And one important aspect of this is offering assistive technology. So again, if we are, especially if we're teaching online, which is obviously something that's happening more and more often, making sure that people have the option, for instance, that we're creating written materials that can be easily accessed by screen readers, that we're providing audio materials that have a textual option, like enabling the auto transcript in a Zoom meeting like this one. Using multimedia, because again, that can be engaging for people, but often with multimedia, we're also providing options for people about how they want to engage. Scaffolding, which means kind of building towards the knowledge in smaller steps, breaking it down into smaller steps so that people can see their progress along the way, and so that we're giving them the tools that they need to get to that final stage. And then providing some support for planning and goal setting. So what this means is just recognizing that in some cases our learners might need some help figuring out how they're going to get through the material, planning their path through the material. So one example for this is giving learners options to share their learning. So for instance, in a class that I taught last semester for the final project, students could choose to write a paper. So we were discussing intellectual freedom and censorship in that course. So they had to choose an intellectual freedom or censorship issue and sort of research it and learn about it and present some both positions on the topic and some solutions, but they had the option of presenting all of that through a written paper, through a conference presentation that they would give to the class, or by building a website that would offer guidance through the topic. All right, so all of that is just background on what this topic of universal design for learning is. But how does this relate to what we do in library and information science? There's actually a number of different ways that this can relate. From my perspective, one of the biggest overlaps between UDL and LIS is the fact that many of us in the information professions offer instruction. And this is true across a lot of different information centers. So in other words, it might be obvious that in a school or school or academic library that we're going to be doing some instruction. This actually happens across all different kinds of information centers, from special and corporate libraries to archives to public libraries. And the sort of form of that instruction might look different, but what's important is that it should always be framed around these principles of UDL. So what we're seeing is that there are more and more positions showing up with instructional responsibilities. So that knowledge of instructional design, including knowledge of universal design for learning, is actually in pretty high demand in the field of LIS. As I said, especially maybe in school and academic libraries, but also in public libraries, archives, and special libraries. When we're providing instruction in LIS settings, we're often providing direct instruction, right? So actually sort of being present in a classroom or a workshop and lecturing and leading people through activities, demonstrating certain skills and helping people with hands-on practice. But that kind of direct instruction is happening in different modalities at this point. So what I mean by that is that certainly we're doing it face-to-face, but we're doing more and more of it online. And so again, there are different needs in terms of providing instruction that meets these universal design for learning principles in the different modalities. And so as information professionals, we have to be aware of that and know how to adapt these principles for the different modalities. As I mentioned, we're doing educational programming, so not everything is a classroom experience per se, but it might be something that's more even socially oriented, but still has some educational aspects to it. So things like reading book groups or movie nights or things like that. And then in addition to giving direct instruction, we're also often creating learning objects and materials. So these can be things like LibGuides, video tutorials, or even just handouts and things that go along with direct instruction like PowerPoints and things like that. And so if we want those materials to be accessible, then we have to understand how to make them accessible, whether it's things like adding alt text to images, making sure that all of our materials meet certain standards in terms of things like color contrast and not using color to convey meaning, the size and types of the fonts that we use and things like that. So these are all ways in which information professionals use these universal design for learning principles in their practice. One other exciting thing that we do as information professionals is we do train the trainer work. And what I mean by that is that, maybe not surprisingly, librarians and other information professionals have actually been ahead of the curve in terms of taking on instructional design, and in particular, taking on online instructional design. So a lot of librarians, in part because we knew that people weren't always able to come to the library to access our materials, were already providing remote services before the pandemic, which means during the pandemic, when everyone else had to suddenly pivot to online, a lot of librarians were in the position of being able to offer support to people. So there were a lot of librarians, especially in academic and schools, that were actually showing faculty how to do this. But again, it's because we already have that knowledge. And so we were helping faculty get their courses online and make them accessible. And then finally, this doesn't just apply to library and information professionals who are out there in the libraries and the archives and things like that. It applies to us, the LIS faculty members, who are doing this kind of instruction in our LIS degree programs. So it's important to remember that for us as faculty, these principles have to carry over into our LIS classroom. In other words, it's not just do as I say, but do as I do, right? I want to put these practices, I want to model them and put them into practice in my own classroom. So that means developing courses and course materials that are accessible for my students from the beginning, keeping that UDL in mind from the first design of the course. And thinking about, again, about the differences across modalities, because I teach both face-to-face and online courses, as my colleague Lisa does. And so recognizing that there are things that we have to do in a face-to-face classroom that are going to be a little bit different than what we do in an online classroom and vice versa, and knowing what sorts of accessibility considerations are applicable in both modalities. We also can teach and write about pedagogy and instruction. So in other words, both as library professionals and as LIS faculty members, if we take on the responsibility of learning UDL and implementing UDL, then what we can also do is share that knowledge with other people by sharing it through our writing, through presentations and workshops and things like that. So as just one quick final note, I want to say that there's a real need for curricula and professional development in this area. There has been a series of studies that have shown that LIS degree programs have typically one course on library instruction and pedagogy, and that's typically not enough to really delve into these topics. It's better than nothing for sure, but it's really not enough to really delve into them. And for those of us who are LIS faculty, in a lot of cases, we get thrown into the classroom without ever being in any kind of course or class that teaches us how to teach. So it's really important to actually recognize that need for understanding pedagogy and instructional design and universal design for learning and building that into our various curricula. But the other thing is recognizing that this is an ongoing learning process, especially as technologies change, the accessibility, the sort of rules around accessibility and the practices around accessibility are also continuing to change. So we have to keep up to date. And so it means making sure that we're taking on that responsibility of finding the professional development opportunities and attending them so that we can keep our own skills up to date. All right, so I am going to stop sharing my screen there, and I don't see any questions or anything like that in the chat, so I'll just turn it over to Lisa.
So after that actually wonderfully organized and informative presentation by Laura, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about things that I've actually done in the classroom that are related to universal design and universal design learning, both things that have been very successful and things where I had missteps or I failed. I'm going to start with the good things because it's always kind of nice to do that. But one of the things is Laura was speaking and I thought about this. This is one of the things that I have always approached in teaching is that when I do assignments, I try to make them relevant for the student. I don't like things to just be, here's this abstract that somehow will make sense later on in life. I really would rather that they do things like find something that interests you, apply this to your dream job, think about how this would work in what you want to do, and we'll do the assignment from that point. In one of the classes that I teach very regularly is Principles of Management for Libraries. And management can be a very dry subject, but often the concepts can be abstract in how you apply them to the workplace. And one of the things I've really worked on a lot over the years, and I've been teaching this course for close to 19 years now, is trying to make these concepts very relevant to the individuals so that they can then understand how to apply it further out. And just to give you an example of this, of approaching an idea from perhaps from a personal standpoint, as opposed to saying, trying to present it from an organizational standpoint, is the concept of motivation. And every semester, you know, we talk about motivation. One of the things I have the students do, and this is both in person and online, is we discuss their motivations for pursuing the degree. Why are they in this graduate LIS program? And it's really a great way for people to gain understanding of how you have this group of people working towards the same goal, but for very different reasons. You know, there might be similar reasons, but that everybody kind of has a unique reason. And it's a way that really helps people understand that motivation is an individual process, and that in the workplace, this is something you really have to think about as you're trying to motivate employees to work. And I would say it's one of those things that really, I can see light bulbs go on all the time, because it really brings up this kind of interesting other idea of looking at things. One of the other things that I've really found that helps learning at every level is when I make a mistake or a misstep, I own up to it. That I tell students that, oops, that's not how that should have been done. Or the other thing I do is I actually encourage dissent in my classroom. I tell students that they are free to disagree with me, that it has to be done with respect, but that part of what they're going to learn, a lot of what they're going to learn in classes is going to be coming from the people around them, so that it takes out the idea that there's only one expert in the room, but that everybody can contribute to the learning process. And, you know, for some people, they just want to know what I have to say. For other people, it's important for them to see multiple points of view for learning. And this is, I've found that to actually be very successful. When I'm looking down, I'm looking at notes. Another thing that I recently did for online classes, and this grew out of the pandemic, but it's one that I have found to be a useful tool, and that is providing office hours. And I know that seems obvious, but literally creating a time that's specifically for the class, that people can come and go as they want. But in an online setting, you don't necessarily have that option in the same way. And it gives students a chance to better bond with each other and to interact with each other and to raise questions that they may not feel comfortable raising in front of the entire class. Now, we do office hours in person, but creating this space in online, it grew out of a student asking if she could host a study hour. And my reaction was, why, yes, of course you can. Are you sure you want to take on that responsibility? And she went with it. And it, you know, I mean, I'll say not everybody attended, but it was a great way to bring ideas in. And then she would tell me some of the questions that came up so that I could address them, so that I could then alter what I was doing to make sure that these ideas were more accessible across the classroom. One of the other things, and this is one that Laura's going to get a kick out of, and this is, I will say, very specifically for my online classes, but proactively closed captioning all of the lectures. This is one of the things that, you know, we kind of learn, you know, it's very easy to do, but in our field, it also involves, it's very easy to do the basic, but it involves a lot more time to go through and make all the corrections. And this is where a challenge can come in, because accents are really fun with how they do the automatic captioning. If you don't speak perfectly, there's going to be some really interesting words that come up. But with proactively doing this, with every lecture I create, proactively captioning them, I've had students who don't need captioning reach out and tell me how much they appreciated having the captioning, how it actually really helped them better engage with the lecture. And so it's an automatic thing that I do at this point, but I will fully admit that grew out of a mistake that I made. And a mistake that I made about, and I will say this was actually really based on somebody being incredibly competent, and I forgot that they needed extra help, which is on me. But it's something that I think it's important to think about in universal design and universal design learning, is that we can make assumptions about the competence of our students, which makes them uncomfortable in asking for help. And this was a student I had over a decade ago. I had her in person and I had her in online courses. And in person, she actually had people who were with her Monday through Friday who were interpreters with sign language, and who actually would interpret her comments and questions in class. And one of the things I learned about that was I needed to provide information ahead of time for the interpreters, because when I was talking about names and terms that weren't common, they needed to know that ahead of time so they could prepare for it. But what had happened was she was in one of my online classes, not a problem. I was able to get her, notes and everything for the lectures. Well, the next one, she was in my class again. And this was, again, an incredibly capable student, didn't even really think about it. And she reached out and said, I can't watch the lectures. I can't, I don't know what you're saying. And I felt horrible about that, because I had just made the assumption she was at, or not even the assumption, it hadn't occurred to me that she really did need that extra step, that she really did need these to be closed captioned, and I hadn't done that. Don't get me wrong, as soon as she contacted me, I made sure that happened. We made sure that she could do what she needed to for that class. But it's one of those things that always sits in the back of my mind, that just because a student is capable, comes across as being incredibly capable and confident, doesn't mean that we shouldn't pay attention to maybe where they're having challenges, or that what we're doing doesn't work universally. And we really need to kind of consider, how do we not put our students on the spot when they need help, but rather have the tools available for them. And I would say there's not just one answer to that. Another practice that I have that is both a positive and a negative is I have, in my online classes, I will use images a lot. I will have students post images to represent things, which I really enjoy, because it gives students a new way to look at things. Again, going back to the management class, the students have to post an image that represents change. And it really does facilitate a great conversation about how we all view this concept that everybody knows, but is not necessarily easy to define. The challenge with that, though, is when you have a student who has a visual disability, and this is not something that they can access. Like I said, I've had students tend to love this exercise because it presents so many different points of view and allows them to dig deeper into these ideas. And then I had a student who had to reach out to me and say, I have no idea what's being posted. And for that entire class, I would actually make a point of writing out descriptions of every single one of the images and sending them to her, so that she could get a read of what was actually in there. That was a lot of extra work on my part, which I was happy to do to make that accessible for her. But it also, reminds me that I have to think about how I'm doing that and who I'm reaching with this, and to provide alternatives for people in those, kind of in that situation. Sorry, checking my notes really quickly again. I was going to say, one of the other things that I do, again, with I would say with online courses, but it's something that I think we do automatically in person. And that is, in my online courses, I do wrap-up lectures every week. The end of the week, I go through everything and put together what's supposed to be a 10 or 15-minute lecture that sometimes turns to 20, 25 minutes, depending on what the week is. Talking about high points, talking about what's come up in the lecture, talking about, how this ties back to other things, things to think about. And one of the things I try to make a point of doing is acknowledging students who have said something that particularly stood out. And it's a way, again, of engaging students. I've had students reach out and say, I can't believe you mentioned me. And I'm thinking to myself, I would have, highlighted that in the classroom. I'm going to highlight it in this situation, but it's a way to further engage with the materials that students are that give students a chance to not just, reading through online discussions can sometimes be overwhelming, and giving them a chance to say, you know, somebody who did read through all of them, here are some of the key points. It really helps them engage with the content a little bit more. Again, I'm doing a quick quick overview. I think maybe one of the last things I would say in here, and this is something I try to, you know, share with my students or do in my classes when I'm teaching in person, I use PowerPoint slides. I've been doing this since I got to Simmons 15 years ago. Because, and this started again with a student who I was informed in one of my early classes that I had a student with an auditory disability, and that PowerPoints would help with their content of the class. I also had an interpreter, and I've done it ever since then. But one of the things I make a point of doing is putting them up ahead of time so that students can work along with them or not as they want to. But I found, you know, I have found that students really, you know, sometimes it's really helpful for them to have it in print as I'm saying it. It's almost like closed captioning in a live sense. Related to that, when I have written parts of online lectures, I provide PDFs so that they can be downloaded. So people don't have to sit at the computer to do it. Because unlike Laura, I have an easier time sitting through a 30-minute podcast than I do sitting and reading something on the computer. I want to download it to read it. And I know that, you know, generational access, all of these things, people have, you know, different levels of engagement with what they want to do online, what they want to do with print, and how they're going to be able to, you know, balance all of these. I always try to also, for both, again, in person and online, I will use videos at a lot of different levels. When I think somebody can explain something better than me, oh, I'm going to include that in our face-to-face class. I'm going to put that up and then we're going to discuss it. You know, I'm going to use that in the online setting and give a chance to discuss it with things like that as well. But it's really trying to find different ways. And I will say through all of this, it's paying attention to the reactions to the different ways in which I try to present information. It's paying attention to what is engaging the students. It's paying attention to what they're feeding back to me in assignments. And like the scaffolding, there's more than one course that I teach where the final assignment is built on 3 previous assignments or 2 previous assignments. So they're constantly building on it. Like Laura, I've recently changed an assignment in one of my classes that it was supposed to be a long research paper. This summer when I taught it, they actually had to do a presentation in Canva. And when I teach this course again in the spring, I'm going to give them an option of doing a 10-minute presentation, a Canva presentation, or a research paper, whichever one actually they would rather do related to the topic. So it gives them different ways in which they can approach the material. So if there's one thing I would say in all of this, I really want to reiterate something that Laura said about this is not retrofitting. This is something that we should be, how we should be planning learning, how we should be planning the ways in which we design our classrooms, the ways in which we design our lectures, the ways in which we design the content. So it gives students the space to really engage with it in a way that works best for them. So at this point, I think I will turn it over to Kate and see if there's any questions.
Definitely. I have not seen any questions come in, but that does not mean that we can't ask questions. So if people do have questions, please feel free once again to put them in the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to unmute and also speak as well. While people are kind of thinking of some questions, I think you both did this fairly well, actually, to talk about kind of different courses that you teach at Simmons and how this kind of like plays into what you teach. But if you could each kind of do maybe a recap on that, I think that would be useful for people to hear, just kind of the different things that you teach at Simmons and how this relates.
Okay. I can go first if you want, because I don't have I'm still unmuted. Actually, both Laura and I teach the course that is Information Sources and Services, which is what we now call the reference course, which I have to say that this is something that has evolved quite a bit over our time because of what people need and what you need to learn. That's a part of it. I also teach, as I said, Principles of Management, Reader's Advisory, international cooperative, LIS, social informatics, and information ethics. And I think that's what I have at the moment. Oh,
Yeah. Excuse me. So as Lisa said, we both teach the information sources and services class. And I think one of the ways this topic relates to that class is because it's a user services class, right? As Lisa said, we used to call it the reference class. And so it's a class that really focuses on providing direct research support and information support to patrons. And so one of the things that we're talking about more now than we have in the past is how to design those services so that, again, they're accessible to everybody. Everything from, it used to be pretty standard for reference desks to be standing height. So in other words, the reference librarians would be sitting on a high stool behind the desk, and the idea was you could walk up to the desk to ask your question. But that actually doesn't work for a lot of people, whether you are maybe not able to stand comfortably, you're not at the right height for that desk, maybe you're in a wheelchair. So everything from that kind of design to thinking about the materials that we create, and I mentioned that. I also teach the user instruction course, so that course is heavily into all of these design elements. I also teach intellectual freedom and censorship. I think I had referred to that. And that, although we don't necessarily talk about service design so much, we definitely talk about policies and how policies can be designed to be equitable or accessible or not. We also talk about just access to information as as a right and a responsibility, and part of that access has to do with not just the policies we make, but also the ways in which we make it accessible, if that makes sense.
yeah, and
Great.
kind of building, sorry, I'm just gonna realize that I just listed what I taught, not necessarily how this is involved with it, but one thing I will say is the role of access is important in pretty much all the courses that I listed, but one of the ones where I spent a lot of time talking about access is actually international cooperative librarianship, because one of the things we have to consider when we provide services is the end user, and how will the end user access whatever it is we're providing for them. And that's where we start talking about things on the level of, not just on the level of how you provide something online, but also language and connectivity. And for that matter, even something as simple as you might create a library, but how do people actually get there? And that, these are things that often will come up even more in some of those things. And obviously in information ethics, oh my, yes, do we spend a lot of time talking about access and what that means and related to information ethics.
And I saw there's a question in the chat. Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah.
About have we dealt with highly sensitive person learners, and if so, how do you use UDL to accommodate HSPs? So I think that HSP really encompasses, I think, a really wide range of sensitivities. And so I think, yes, certainly we've encountered this both in our own teaching, but then also talked about how to design for different aspects of HSP in service, right? And so, one of the things that we talk about, for instance, in the reference course, is that we've been given a set of behavioral guidelines by our professional association that hasn't been updated in almost 10 years and is in serious need of updating. And one of the things that it doesn't address well are things like neurodiversity, right? So the guidelines tell us to make eye contact with people, and which is okay. It's not necessarily that eye contact is bad, but in some situations, both for people from different cultures as well as for people who may have certain kinds of sensitivities, that may be actually really uncomfortable. And so I think part of it is being critically reflective on what we're being told to do as professionals from the start, and then thinking about what are the ways in which, again, we can think about our services and our practices so that they are encompassing more of these so that the practices are sensitive to these sensitivities. So that's one example that I can think of.
Well, and I think one of the other things that I try to do, and I know for a fact Laura tries to do this as well, is to create an environment where these learners feel comfortable coming and speaking to us. That they feel comfortable pointing out that, okay, I have an issue with this, and working with them on it. It's not the easiest thing in the world to do. And, sometimes you try to encourage this and it never happens, but it really is, how do you build the environment where people do have the highly sensitive part of this, and making sure that you are not alienating them in class, making sure that you're engaging with them in a way that things that make sense to them. And I'll be honest with you, it's going to be a constant learning process. There are times I've done this well, and there are times when I've realized that I've misstepped. But the point is, trying to be as encouraging as possible to be able to work with people in a way that helps them, not in a way that I think they need to be helped.
Great. I have not seen any more questions in the chat, but people, please feel free to put them in. One thing that I think you've also kind of addressed this as well, but I'll bring it back as well, is just thinking about, how universal design can relate to, what makes information science professionals successful or students successful. I think it's kind of, people probably have put those things together, but if you want to maybe kind of talk a little bit about that, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So I think part of the success, part of the way in which it influenced success is that, to the point that Lisa just made, that kind of design makes people feel that these services are for them, right? If we're talking about educational services, then they feel like they belong in that classroom. If we're talking about reference services, for instance, it makes them feel like those services are for them, as opposed to a design that might make them feel like it's not for them, or at least they're not going to be comfortable using it. And there's actually some great research that we talk about in the reference related class that shows that, so when we think about offering research services in libraries, we usually talk about getting people information, right? Answering their questions. And as information professionals, we might focus very narrowly on the right information. But the research shows that the people that we're interacting with are at least as much concerned with how we treat them, right? And with the sort of affective aspects of the interaction as they are with whether or not they got the information they asked for. And so in a lot of cases, at least 25% of people have said that they wouldn't go back to the library, or at least they wouldn't go back to that same librarian because they didn't feel comfortable. And so I think that if we're designing services and environments that make people feel comfortable, there's going to be success just in the sense that people will feel they belong and will be willing to come to us and use our resources and interact with our services and things like that.
Yeah, and to build a little bit on, again, what Laura said, sorry, I put her on the spot and made her go first, is that one of the things actually, again, when I'm teaching the course that we both teach, is I talk about how important it is that we make it easy to find things in the library as it is to have people ask questions. That the vast majority of people who walk through the door don't actually won't actually ask us a question, but we can still serve them. We can still design our services. We can design our setting so that they can come in and figure out what it is that they want to do without having to speak to us. And that, fortunately, unfortunately, however you want to look at it, is that some people forget that librarians exist, but find the library an amazing resource. And that's actually to our credit. That's exactly, on this basis, that as we're creating services in a way that help people, regardless as to whether or not we are directly interacting with them. And that, again, it's a principle of UDL that that I would want to see carried out by anybody that goes through my classroom, in all honesty.
Well, that is great. thank you so much. I think we're getting almost to time, and it's actually perfect. I want to give people a little breather between sessions if they're planning to go to another InfoCon session. I want to thank both Lisa and Laura for presenting today. Thank you so much. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. If you do have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us at Simmons University. We also have an InfoCon email address, and we can also answer questions there. But we hope you learned something today, and we hope to engage with you further. And once again, thank you so much, Lisa and Laura.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for attending and thank you for listening.
And enjoy the rest of InfoCon, everyone. Bye.